Do you find yourself binge eating or feeling out of control with food in the evening hours? You're not alone. This is the most common time that we see binge eating behavior occur. My name is Shena, and I'm a registered dietitian specializing in the care of persons with eating disorders. Today, we'll dig into some of the reasons why we most frequently see binge eating in the evening hours and what we can do about it. So, the first thing I want to dig into is we really want to identify whether what we're experiencing is actually binge eating. So, many times we might confuse things like emotional eating or just feeling really hungry with binge eating. In fact, these things could not be more different. So, let's really dig into what the differences are because we're going to handle each of these situations differently. Binge eating doesn't just mean eating large quantities of food. A binge is actually defined by eating large quantities of food, but also feeling out of control with the food. Like you can't stop. And that's the hallmark of what distinguishes binge eating from other eating behaviors. If you're binge eating, you'll also experience extreme guilt, shame, or anxiety after you're done consuming that food. So, the lack of control and the extreme guilt are what differentiates a binge from other types of eating behaviors. Now, it's really important that we distinguish this because if we're experiencing something like emotional eating, where we might go for food because maybe we had a difficult day or our boss yelled at us at work, that is actually very different from a binge. And it's actually going to be very important that we honor the food consumption and emotional eating, and that's totally normal. Most of us are going to emotionally eat from time to time, and we really want to honor the emotional eating because if we don't, it's going to turn into binge eating. The same thing is true with extreme hunger or just feeling really hungry. If we don't honor that, that is ultimately going to lead to binge eating. So when you think about your eating behavior in the evening, think, am I feeling out of control with this food? Like I can't put this food down? And am I experiencing extreme guilt, shame, and anxiety around the food? And if so, let's proceed with some of these behaviors to help you reduce the binge eating in the evening. Binge eating in the evening is particularly appealing for many because there's not a lot of other individuals around. Maybe family members have gone to sleep, we're not at work or school any longer, and we're now free to engage in some of our favorite food choices, which may have been off limits for us throughout the day. We also have the most access to food in the evening often. So we're at home, we have the refrigerator, the pantry, where maybe this isn't accessible throughout the day. So those are some of the environmental factors that lead to binge eating being more common in the evening hours. Binge eating also is common in the evening hours because it's often associated with self care, reducing stress, and all of the things that we might want to do when we're kind of winding down for the day. Other reasons are that most of the time, if we're binge eating in the evening, we may have been restricting our food in some way, either mentally or physically throughout the day. So, for example, we might try not eating breakfast, lunch, either intentionally or unintentionally. And by the end of the day, we're just really hungry. We may also be avoiding certain foods through the day, and we may just feel the lack of control in further restricting these during the evening and also when the foods are accessible. So, what do we do about it? The first thing that we want to do is recognize that all binge eating comes from food restriction. In fact, while the behavior is different in the way that it is carried out, binge eating is food restriction. So, binge eating is not the problem, it is the byproduct of food restriction. So, rather than try to correct the binge eating, we're actually going to correct the food restriction. Now, for somebody that binge eats, this can feel overwhelming. The restriction portion of what we call the binge restrict cycle is the only time we often feel in control of our food. So to take that away can feel unraveling. But I promise you, if we do not correct the food restriction, you will continue to binge eat, and this problem will escalate. So, in order to try to minimize the food restriction, the first thing that we want to do is get the meals and snacks normalized. Let's get in breakfast, lunch, dinner, and at least two snacks throughout the day, but I usually encourage three. So, when we think about a meal, it's also important to think about that meal composition. We want to have something that contains a protein, a fruit and or a veggie, and some carbs and some fats in it when we're thinking about our plate. For a snack, we want to have one to two of these components, preferably two, if we're trying to reduce those nighttime binges. This is the first step in reducing those nighttime binges. But also, many of us have food rules and restrictions that are continuing to escalate these binges. So, these food rules might look like I don't eat chips, or I can't have more than two cookies, or I don't eat carbs. All of these mental forms of restriction, even if we give in and actually engage in those food choices, could potentially lead to a binge. So, the next thing that we want to do to reduce or get rid of these binge behaviors is we want to really identify where those mental restrictions are coming into place and try to work some of these food choices into our food schedule on a regular basis. Now, if after we've gotten the meals and snacks normalized throughout the day, if we're still experiencing binge eating at night, there's a few things that we're going to want to do. The first thing is recognize that this is actually normal in the initial stages of normalizing those meals and snacks. So for several weeks, we may still experience that binge eating at night because our body's just getting used to these new routines. But some other things that you can do to help mitigate some of these binge eating behaviors at night are things like changing the environment. So, for example, if you notice yourself always binging in front of the television or video games, let's make sure that we are positioning ourselves at a table to eat if we're binging at night. Sometimes just the shift in environment can help to reduce those binge behaviors. We might also do things like change the temperature in the room. Another thing that I encourage to help you reduce binge eating is, can we push off that binge for just a few minutes? So, for example, you might start with just pushing off a binge for 5 minutes in the evening. So, for example, if you find yourself always eating something or wanting to go to the kitchen at 9 p.m., can we push that off till 9:05, 9:10, and so on and so forth? And sometimes just dysregulating that schedule can be a good tool to helping reduce or eliminate binges. The next thing I recommend is slow down. Many of us that are binge eating notice there is an urgency in our behavior. So sometimes if we can just slow down, if we're experiencing a binge, that can be all that's needed to help shake that binge eating behavior up. So some ways to slow down: set a timer. Make sure that we are taking a full 30 minutes to consume whatever food that we're binging on. We might also try taking a sip of water or setting down our fork between each of our bites. Another fun way to help slow down with our eating is to use chopsticks. Another tool that I encourage for helping to reduce binge eating is schedule a binge. So, because all binge eating comes from food restriction, if we schedule a binge and we actually set our mind up to anticipate that food is going to be coming, this takes us out of the scarcity mindset around food and over time can help to reduce or eliminate binges and help us feel safe around food. Lastly, we maybe want to examine the food dynamic in the house of other individuals that might be living with us. If these people are open to it, it might be worth having a discussion of how you're trying to work through some of these binges with them. And this discussion might include setting some boundaries about the ways in which they talk about food and or your body. So a really simple way to articulate this to them is please don't make comments at all of any sort on my food, on how much I'm having, when I am having it, or what I am having at any time. Same goes for the body. I always like to say, don't comment on people's bodies unless they're on fire. Because if we do live in a household where people are frequently making comments on food and or body, that can sometimes lead us to really foster that mental restriction again. Now, it is understandable that this is not possible for everyone or a problem for everyone, but it's just something to keep in mind if you find yourself continually struggling with binge eating in the evening hours. I hope that this video was helpful for you. If you love the content and found it helpful, please like and subscribe and share it with a friend.